In the small town I grew up in, there used to be this movie theater. It was in a decrepit old building and only had 3 or 4 screens. It wasn't that great, but as a teenager in a small town, it was at least something, and meant my friends and I didn't have to trek into the city to see a movie. Many weekends were spent with my friends sitting in the musky movie theater and shoveling over salty popcorn into our mouths. Back then, if I'd known how dark a trip to the movies would end up being, I never would have stepped foot in that place. It was an evening in late summer, and I was on a first date with a guy named Lee. We arranged to meet outside of the movie theater. I was running a little late, but he was cool about this and bought me my ticket and popcorn. We were in screen number 2, which was at the far side of the lobby down these narrow steps. Since we were late, the movie theater was dark with only the dim floor lights to guide us. I followed him to our seats, the sound of the opening of the movie echoing behind us. In the darkness, I made out about, at most, 10 other shadowy figures in there with us. I realized how dead it was probably due to the time of year, since most people were out of town or on vacation. I sat next to Lee in one of the middle rows. I saw someone else sitting at the end of our row and heard them rustle in their seat, but at this point, I didn't give them a second thought, and instead just focused on the screen. Back then, I hadn't been on many dates before, so I was nervous, and in hindsight, a movie was the worst date idea since it makes talking pretty much impossible. Once the movie started, it was so loud in there that we could barely hear anything else, much less each other. About a third of the way into the movie, I felt a hand touch my thigh. I thought it was Lee's. I had no reason not to think that, since he was sitting at a slouched angle with the popcorn bucket balanced on the armrest in between us. He kept his hand there, his fingers gently tapping against my thigh. It was about 10 minutes later when I felt an arm around my shoulder. Then I looked at him and saw him smile at me and dig his hand into the popcorn bucket. My eyes filled with horror when I realized that I could see both of Lee's hands. But someone was still touching my thigh. I jerked back, accidentally knocking the popcorn off the armrest and sending it flying everywhere. It was at the exact point a big action scene was happening in the movie, so I guess that drowned out my reaction. That's when I noticed a dark figure was crouched beneath the seats. A figure of a man. He'd been the one tapping his fingers against my thigh, not Lee. I couldn't see him fully in the dark, but I could see enough to see the deranged grin on his face and the flicker in his eyes. Upon seeing that I saw him, he gave me a creepy wave, and then scurried back to the end of the row and sat back in his seat like nothing had happened. I rushed out of the movie theater, my heart pounding like crazy, and Lee followed me. I explained to him what happened, and he was furious and marched back in there to confront that guy. There was no way I was going back in there, so I stayed there and tried to calm myself down. When Lee returned, he said the man was no longer in the row and it was too dark in there to find him. I'd been outside the door to the screen and no one had passed by, which meant that creepy guy was still in there somewhere. I was terrified and didn't want to alert the staff. Instead, I just wanted to leave. So Lee drove me home. When I was back home and had scrubbed the spot where that freak had touched my leg, I opened my bag and couldn't find my wallet anywhere. That guy had stolen my ID and about $40 out of my purse. I called the movie theater to ask them to search for it. They did search, but they said they couldn't find it anywhere. I suddenly had this horrible thought that maybe that creep took it and now knew where I lived. For the next couple of days, nothing happened. But then a few days later, I came home to find $40 slid under the front door. No note, no nothing. When I picked the money up, it had a strange smell to it. I don't know what it was, but something was wrong with it. I checked the porch and found a bunch of change thrown in the plant pot. I swear it was the same change that was in my purse. For weeks after that, I was convinced that man was going to appear randomly somewhere. It made me jittery and on edge. I couldn't relax and flinched at every little noise I heard. I thought it was him coming to get me. But nothing else happened after that. I don't know who that creepy man was, or why he did what he did. The movie theater closed that winter and has since been converted into apartments. Even now, all these years later. Thinking about what happened that night gives me some serious mental trauma. I used to work at a local movie theater in my hometown in Ohio. I hated the job since the customers tended to be impatient and rude. They were always complaining about the snack prices and quality. And yeah, I heard it all. It became tiring having to deal with them all the time. I tried to just roll with it or block it out, since I needed the money back then. On this occasion, it was coming to the close of a busy Friday night. The last movie was about to start, and as a result, the lobby only had a couple of stragglers in it. I was tidying up, sweeping away any loose bits of popcorn, mopping up spilled soda, that sort of thing, when I noticed this couple came in. The woman had long blonde hair, wore a silk scarf, and was in her 20s. The man had short hair and looked a little older. I'd guess 30-ish. He had this expressionless look on his face, and I don't know. I just sensed something was off about him. He put his hands on the concession counter, and I politely asked him what he would like. At first, he didn't say anything. He just kept his hands pressed on the counter and laughed this gruff type of laugh. I asked him again, and this time, he shook his head and said, "No, the popcorn tastes off." Before I could reply to this, he walked over to the woman and they walked towards Theater 2. My coworker had overheard the whole thing and called the man a weirdo. The last movie finished around 1 a.m. By then, I just wanted to go home and go to bed, so I wasn't paying much attention to the people leaving. I didn't remember seeing the couple leave, but I just assumed they had gone out when I wasn't looking. I was helping my colleague clean up Theater 2, sweeping up popcorn and candy wrappers, when I saw something in one of the back rows. A man's sneaker. I thought this was odd, as I was used to strange things being left behind, but never a shoe. When I bent over to pick it up, I saw that it was full of popcorn, but then I saw a body squirming around further down the row. It was a guy, probably about 19. I was about to ask what he was doing when I saw that something was binding his hands and feet together, cable ties, and his mouth was gagged with a scarf. I looked at his feet. He was missing one sneaker. The whole thing was bizarre and freaky. I shouted for my coworker to come over, and I stayed with the guy while they went to get scissors. When I cut him free, this guy spat out a mouthful of popcorn and started babbling on about a woman being tricked and the popcorn tasting off. It was all really weird, but I saw the fear in that guy's eyes. There was no faking that. We took the guy in the back employee's room and got him some water. After that, he started to make a bit more sense and explained that a woman had been talking to him. After describing her, it matched the description of the blonde woman I saw coming in with the man earlier. She'd asked to sit with him and share his popcorn. Then during the movie, he felt a knock on the head. He remembered seeing a man hover over him and tell him not to eat the popcorn because it was off. The next thing he remembers was waking up tied up in the darkness, his mouth full of sour-tasting popcorn. One of my coworkers called the police and we waited for our manager to show up. I was sitting in the lobby when I noticed the popcorn machine. The glass had been smashed and bits of popcorn and glass were all over the floor. Back then there wasn't security footage in the movie theater, but there was in the lobby. On it, I saw grainy footage of that couple appearing when the lobby was empty. They must have been hiding somewhere and waiting. The woman didn't have her scarf on anymore, and waited by the concession counter while the man smashed the popcorn machine. He stared directly at the camera, the same expressionless look on his face before they both left through the back door. I don't know why they did what they did, with vandalizing the popcorn machine and tying that poor guy up, but it all seemed really messed up to me. I quit not long after that, and I haven't been back to the movie theater ever since. The movie theater in my town closed down decades ago. No one's done anything with the building since. It's abandoned and all boarded up, but that doesn't mean that people don't still go there. I know this for a fact. This took place a few years ago. An old buddy was back in town for a family function. We arranged to meet up at a bar, and yeah, we did consume a few too many beers. As we were walking home past the old movie theater, my buddy got excited and started recalling the old movies we'd seen there as kids. One of the planks of wood across the window was loose, so suddenly he was suggesting we go check it out, for old time's sake. I didn't want to go in there. The whole place was creepy as hell from the outside, so I didn't want to even think about what it was like inside. I told him he was crazy, but he didn't listen. So as he climbed through the gap, I found myself doing the same. The main lobby stank, a mixture of urine, mold, and decay. It seemed to reek from the damp walls. The rotting concession stand had partly sunk in on itself, and there were old tickets and bits of blackened fabric, I don't know what they were from, scattered across the dirty floor. There was this really weird energy to this place. It was enough to sober me up and figure out that I didn't want to be there any longer. I told my friend I was leaving and headed back towards the exit. He started calling me a wuss and a coward and stuff like that. I knew he was only being a drunk jerk, but I hadn't seen him in years, and I didn't want him thinking badly of me. That's how I ended up following him along the hallway and into one of the old movie theaters. It had been pretty dark in the lobby, but in there, it was pitch black. We shone our cell phone flashlights around the hall, and it was a mess. I'm talking broken chairs, old wrappers, and mold sprouting out of the darkness. The smell was so bad I thought I was going to puke. He must have had enough, since he said he was leaving. As I followed him out there, I heard a creaking noise behind us. Before I could register what it was, something else happened. The movie screen changed from blank to static gray, and then a movie started playing. There was no sound, just the images. I pulled my buddy out of there and he started getting angry with me and thought I was messing with him. I made it very clear that there was no way I could have started the movie, since I'd been with him the entire time. We stumbled our way back into the lobby. Then we heard it. Strange sounds that were a cross between heavy breathing and someone talking gibberish under their breath. They were coming from over by the sunken concession stand. We both spun around, our hearts racing. We realized that we weren't alone in there. My friend was so freaked out that he couldn't move. He clung to me and refused to leave until I checked behind the concession stand. I ended up agreeing to do it just to shut him up. I told him to stay there and cautiously stepped over the dirt towards the counter. The closer I got to it, the louder the breathing and gibberish became. Through the sunken part of the counter, I saw a blur of movement. I was a couple of steps away from it when I stopped. My heart was in my chest, and I didn't want to go any closer to the counter. Something was definitely behind it. I just didn't know what. I turned back to my friend and shook my head at him. I wasn't crazy or drunk enough to walk any closer to that counter. I was about to walk away when I realized something. I couldn't hear the heavy breathing anymore. Then it happened. This dark, lanky figure jumped out from behind the counter. I could tell it was a man with long, matted hair and these wild eyes, but that wasn't the worst part. Something was smudged all over his face. Something dark red. He just stared at me, then started muttering gibberish under his breath. I swore at the top of my voice and ran towards the exit. My friend had already headed that way, so I scrambled out of there, my mind a frantic mess. I don't know who that man in there was, but thankfully he didn't try and chase after us. I've tried to make sense of what happened, but I can't. I don't know what that creepy guy was doing in there, and if it was just him, or if there were any others in there too. My buddy and I never spoke about what happened after that. We lost touch years ago. I still live in the same town, and when I have to drive past that old movie theater, I'm reminded of that night, and find myself wondering if, even after all this time, that creepy man is still in there.